Well, welcome to another edition of Scotland's Choice. Let's hear who we have on the programme today.
Hi there, I'm Carol Monaghan. I'm the Member of Parliament for Glasgow North West.
And I'm Brendan O'Hara. I am the Member of Parliament for Argyll and Bute.
Well, welcome to Scotland's Choice. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to talk, instead of talking about independence overtly, because this is obviously an independence podcast, we're going to talk about the State of the Union. It is about time to look at what's happening. So let's start with you, Brendan, with cash for honours, contracts for chums, peerages against security advice, Partygate, and much, much more going on. What does the state of the UK government say to you about the State of the Union?
Well, I think it's almost a metaphor for the union. You know, it's a bust ball. This government is a bust ball, and it's led by, it's a rogue government led by a rogue Prime Minister, a guy who has no moral compass, no scruples, no humility, none of the characteristics that I would imagine that most people across the UK would expect their Prime Minister to have. This guy is devoid of all of them. And even to the extent that 148 of his backbenchers tried to oust him during the week, but he survived and he will go on. But he is concentrating more and more power in his own hands. And I think the union is a hole beneath the waterline. And the only card they have now is to try and prevent us having a referendum when we want to have it.
Carol?
Because they'll lose.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because you would think at this point with the Tories in the state that they're in, that there would be a bit of introspection, a bit of evaluation of their own self. But what they're doing instead is throwing out all sorts of insults towards Scottish Government, towards Scottish members of Parliament, as though somehow we're of a similar ilk. It's interesting, but I think I should remind the viewers that it was just along the road from where I am just now in Partick that we got a very astute assessment of Boris Johnson, and it was painted on the side of the building, and it said Boris Johnson is a pure, and I'll let the listeners fill in the blanks. That was painted over within a few days by the council, but they then repeated the message that Boris Johnson was still a pure, and I think that probably sums it up. But interestingly enough, although my constituents here in Partick are very are able to work out the manner of man that Boris Johnson is, it seems that he still has a decent amount of support within people of England. And I think it is important that we kind of step back and reflect on that and say, are we going to align ourselves with that? Or are we going to choose a different path? And I think more and more people are starting to think, if that is what the people of England are voting for, then it is time that we do think differently about what we are, whether they were pro-independence before or not. Because, as always, England gets what England votes for, and Scotland gets what England votes for.
I think that's a really good point, Carol. And I made this point to somebody yesterday, that if you remember where Tony Blair was against John Major, and you remember what we thought was sleaze and scandal with Major, God, you look back in those days now as like halcyon days of democracy, and Blair was absolutely miles ahead of John Major. The procession to Downing Street in 97 was, everyone knew from years out it was going to be a landslide. Starmer now, only 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points ahead. He should be double digits, multiple double digits ahead, and he's not. And therefore, I don't think we can just take it for granted that because we can see through Johnson and the Tories and what they're like, that'll necessarily translate into how other parts of this union vote.
It's not just the kind of scandals and things that are hitting the headlines. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't hit the headlines in terms of the mechanics of Westminster. I mean, the public must imagine there are all kinds of democratic and constitutional protections for their rights, for their monies, for the money, for their freedoms. What is your view of the actual case at Westminster just now?
Will I kick off? I mean, it's pretty much you can buy your way into power. We had years ago, we had the very infamous Cash for Honour scandal, but it seems we're back in that. Not only can you buy your way into power, but you can also buy your way into contracts. You can buy your way into influence. You can buy your way into meetings that other people don't have access to. So it's pretty bad. And I think we also have to look at what. So it's all very well saying that if you're rich and powerful enough, you can get into a position where you can influence democracy. Goodness, that's quite a statement in itself. But we also have to look at how that impacts other people, and the erosion of rights of other people is quite incredible as well. And we've had over the last few years all sorts of things. We're talking about sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. We've had the Windrush scandal. We're now looking at curbing the freedom to protest. So it's pretty, as well as one group of people being able to buy influence, we've got another group of people that are having all sorts of legal sort of protections taken away from them. It's a pretty worrying time.
Yeah, I think the United Kingdom is on a precipice. I think it's going somewhere which is extremely dangerous, and it'll be very difficult to come back from. And I mean, I said in the House of Commons the other day there on a debate on the ministerial code, the 48 hours of having been utterly eviscerated by the Sue Gray report, and having stood there and said how humbled he was and how contrite he was. First thing he did was he altered the ministerial code so that he avoided more scrutiny and gave himself more powers. And it lays bare what we have always known as being the major fault in this whole system, is that there are no rules. And everything is based on the good chap philosophy, that everyone who's in that office will act with decency and honour. Well, what happens when you have a guy, which we have now, who has no decency, who is devoid of honour, who has no sense of shame, and who will just tough it out until the news cycle moves on? And he is taking his cronies with him, and there is, as we have discovered to our cost, there is almost nothing that the Parliament can do to stop him.
And of course,
this whole nonsense of good chap philosophy simply doesn't work.
And of course, having said he was humbled, went to the 1922 committee and said he'd do all over again.
Do it all again, right? Absolutely.
Well,
So, I mean, I think we're in completely uncharted waters with this guy, and I think that he is in a strange place now where he's 148 having voted against him, and you're trying to second guess what his next move might be.
Well, of course, that all leads on to some of the difficulties that the public are actually feeling because of policies that at Westminster. We've seen some pretty stark economic figures just this week. Although much of the world has had pressures on inflation and rising costs, why do you think it's so much worse here in the UK as opposed to elsewhere?
Whose turn is it to answer first?
Well, you've started. You've started this.
I mean, I think we cannot escape Brexit. You know, Brexit looms a massive shadow over everything that we do, and everything that happens, and roots lead back to Brexit. I challenged Mr. Mogg yesterday in the House of Commons. It was about how, yes, Brexit has been successful if you're a hedge fund manager or a city spiv. But if you're a small SME company who has, for the past 4 decades, perfected exporting into Europe, your entire market base was predicated on the idea we would always be part of the European Union, you're sinking, and you're sinking fast. And I challenged Mogg on this yesterday, to which he replied, the sun is shining. You know, the sun is shining if you're a multi-millionaire. But if you're a small business owner and you're trying to keep a business going, you're you're so up against it, it's almost not true. So we have all the external factors, and a lot of which are affecting the world. But what we have uniquely here is we have committed the most grievous act of economic self-harm on ourselves, I mean the UK, and we're now looking around for excuses as to why this is happening. We know why it's happening. It's happening because of Brexit.
Yeah, and I would add to that as well, Brendan, and I think Brendan's right. The biggest issue here is Brexit. It's the ability to trade. It's the ability to actually do business. Has been massively reduced. And if you look at a country like Ireland, for example, it's experiencing the same inflation, not quite as high, but it's experiencing inflation. It is experiencing fuel cost rises. But actually, its economy is booming. And its economy is booming because it's able to trade. And if the economy is booming, then you have some protection and some ability to raise funds to deal with this. But what we've done in the same situation, as well as Brexit, we've got these costs rising, but have we seen any big drop in fuel duty? No, we've not. So as the oil price rises, so does the tax income from that. We've seen national insurance rises, which impact those that living in the very margins. We've got extremely high levels of VAT. That could be reduced. That would make a difference as well to basic household incomes. Because, I mean, we heard yesterday the report that said, the OECD report that said economic growth next year is expected to drop to zero. I mean, that's brutal. People literally are not going to have the money for all the little extras that they would have, and some people won't have the money even for the basics. It is problematic, and it's problematic because we've got two groups of people. We've got groups of people that read about the headline cost of living crisis but are never touched by it. And we've got the people that are actually living this. And unfortunately, more and more people in our communities are not just been touched, but are been hit brutally by it.
And these are policy choices we're talking about that are affecting people.
Absolutely. These are policy. And you also look at countries like, for example, Italy, who are helping their citizens with the cost of there are things that can be done. They're helping their citizens with fuel costs. Meanwhile, in your constituencies, Brendan and Drew, you're producing renewable energy, and yet it's costing an absolute fortune to even feed that into the national grid. Why are producers here in Scotland been hammered in order to provide energy at low cost?
I'm going to bring Brendan in on that in just a second, but I think you're talking about other countries. There's lots of other countries making interventions to help people just now. Norway, over a certain amount, are paying 80% of increased energy costs for the citizens. And we've seen the situation in France where they've been able to have much lower energy cost rises as well because of policy decisions they've taken. Brendan, you want to come in on that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look back to the 70s and the 80s where Scotland produced the energy and received virtually nothing of the benefits, we're in grave danger of having it again as another energy boom on our doorstep, and we're in grave danger of missing out on it. And even a sort of a minimal ask of a bit of investment for R&D and some tax breaks for tidal or offshore. There are requests being made of this government, which, because it doesn't mean that much to them, or they don't really understand, or let's be frank, they're so they're all nuclear, that they will not make the investment. And so we are on the cusp of this second energy boom, this green renewable boom, and we're in great danger of missing out as we did in the 70s and 80s.
So, I mean, this is the question. When people are arguing about the broad shoulders of the UK and independence, how can other similarly sized countries to Scotland, normal independent countries, be faring so much better than those broad shoulders of the UK, Brendan?
Well, I think quite simply because they have the political power to set their own path and to decide their own priorities. And I think as well, for a lot of European countries is because, if you like, they have the broad shoulders of the European Union, where they can operate within that single market and they have that ability to move freely between them. So I've always said that Brexit would be a disaster for the United Kingdom. It would be just unbelievably damaging to Scotland. But if you're on the periphery of a periphery, like many of our constituents are, Drew, this is catastrophic. This is existential. And yet we have the ability and we have the natural resources to turn it round, but we don't have the political power that would let us do it. And that's the biggest thing for me is having the political power to set your own path, to decide your own priorities, both economically and socially, and most importantly, repopulate this country as well.
Carol, you mentioned Ireland earlier, and there's lots of other countries like Norway, Sweden, Finland, other countries that are out there making their own choices, doing their own things for their people just now. What does Scotland not have that these countries do?
It's well, I think Brendan's already said it. It doesn't have the power to make its own policies that it needs. It can't choose its own immigration policies. I mean, I find it funny. I get emails occasionally from constituents that talk about the SNP letting in all these people and letting in these asylum seekers and these refugees, and you kind of think, if only we've got a war in Ukraine. I've got constituents emailing me all the time saying, I've got room in my house, can I bring somebody in? But what, in the middle of the most brutal war that we've seen in decades in Europe, we've got a government in Westminster that says refugees fleeing this war need to have a visa. And crazy situations like, a mum and two kids, the mum and one of the kids gets granted a visa and the other kid doesn't get a visa. What kind of country is this? This is great. So I think first and foremost, we need to be able to make our own policies around immigration. Scotland, many of the countries that you've just mentioned, Drew, are countries that have probably suffered similarly from Scotland with elderly and dwindling populations. We need people to come here, and immigration has been so positive. When we were part of the European Union, we saw our tourism industry flourishing because we were able to get young people coming and working in our hotels and our hospitality. That was really important. But alongside that, we also had, academic coming and working in our universities. We had business people coming and setting up and providing jobs there as well. So I think immigration is one of the most important things that an independent Scotland has control over. And sadly, it's not something we have control of here in Scotland.
Yep. Brendan, Westminster keeps telling us that we need the UK for Scotland. Why is Scotland uniquely unable to operate as an independent country, according to people that would say that at Westminster?
Why indeed? I mean, it's just that almost we've been conditioned to believe that we are somehow uniquely incapable in the world of looking after our own affairs and looking after our own people, or taking a different path from whatever government happens to be in power at Westminster. And I think people have we have a job to do. We have a job to do to sell that positive vision of Scotland, and also to say to people it's about responsibility. Mm-hmm. You take responsibility for this country and where it goes in the direction and the shape that we want to see it. And what Carol was saying there as well, we have this immigration policy which does not suit the needs of Scotland. In fact, it's actively working against the needs of Scotland. Now, it was decided in a sort of, it was decided around the needs of people in Kent and all the rest of all these channel constituencies where the political power is. But this isn't neutral for Scotland. This is actively working against the interests of Scotland. And if there is one thing, I'll probably come on to it later, is what we would do an immigration policy that works for Scotland is absolutely essential.
So, you're talking there about taking responsibility. Scotland going forward as an independent country, if we're taking that message to people, it won't all be plain sailing, will it? There'll be mistakes, there'll be things that go wrong in government. Those are things that would happen. How do the mistakes and the things that go wrong compare to those that are happening at Westminster just now? I mean, I'm reading about the Treasury making a mistake over interest rates just now, which is going to cost £11 billion. How do the kind of mistakes an independent Scotland would make fare against the ones that are being made day by day at Westminster just now?
I think one of the things about being independent is you've got to be free to furrow your own path. And I think of kids leaving the house and going and setting up in their own home. Are they going to get everything right? No, they're not. Are they going to, are there things that maybe they would choose to do differently? Probably. But I also think of myself, and I've got, kids thinking of along those ways at the moment. Do I get
surely
right?
not your fault.
I know, it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe, but I don't get everything right either. But in terms of mistakes, I always find it incredible that we talk about an overspend of whatever on particular contract or this or that. I mean, let's talk about HS2. I mean, HS2 is
cancelled. The link to Scotland cancelled, yeah.
Yeah, so the link to Scotland's cancelled, so we're not getting any benefit out of it. In fact, I think it's reckoned it's going to take longer to go from Scotland to London because you would need to change from an HS2 train to a regular train and wait for that. So it's going to actually make our journeys longer. But the money, I think, to start with, and I'm sure you guys have got the figures, but it was something like 50 billion to start with, and now it's estimated it's going to cost over 120 billion. Now, do we see that smacked about when we're talking about wasted money? So there's things like that. It seems that whatever things or challenges the Scottish government have, they're always much worse than mistakes that have been made at Westminster. Because Westminster, of course, couldn't possibly make it. And I do think the media have a role to play in this as well, because the media are quite happy to slam the Scottish government and quite happy to ignore the issues that Westminster have. I mentioned HS2. We could talk about the cost of Crossrail. We could talk about the price of Trident renewal. We could talk about the Ajax tanks that are pretty much useless, but several billion have been spent on them. So there's many things that we could talk about that has been wasted money that seems okay for Westminster to waste, but goodness, don't waste £100,000 in Scotland. We naughty jocks should.
I think as well, going back to your original point about independence and mistakes, and I think we have a responsibility, to be honest, with the Scottish people, that independence isn't necessarily a panacea. There is no silver bullet. But what independence allows us to do is to start turning the oil tanker, and perhaps rather than having, the captain of that oil tanker being almost exclusively drawn from the same elite group of old Etonians or old Havarians or Havorians, or the hell they call themselves, that a Scottish government, I think, as we've seen at Holyrood, is far more reflective and representative of the people who elect it than any UK government that I've ever seen. This self-perpetuating elite who seem to constantly, whether in politics or in the civil service, seem to run the United Kingdom. We've got to break that link. And I think that where the Scottish government has done very well is that when it does make mistakes, there is a sense in the community, the wider community, that yes, they make mistakes. Yes, they should be held to account for those mistakes. Yes, they should be called out on those mistakes. But there is a overriding sense that they were honest mistakes, and that this is a government which is on the side of the people. And I think that's really, really important, because I don't think that is a thought down the road. And I absolutely take Carol's point, but a cancellation of a train timetable and Nicola's on the front page of the paper You would never see that in the United Kingdom term, the cancellation of trains and Boris Johnson being in front page. So there's an equivalence there, which equivalence is just not there. But I don't think that's permeating into the wider psyche, because I believe that Scottish people see that this is a government that is on their side. And yes, it does make mistakes.
And they can also see that any government they would have in Scotland would be under far greater scrutiny than the government they might have at Westminster. Okay, I want to just go back a wee bit to the people in your constituencies. You both mentioned those. How are people in your different constituencies affected by policies that they didn't vote for at the moment? Brendan, you want to start with that?
But again, at the risk of sounding like a stuck record, with a Tory government we didn't elect, with a Brexit we didn't vote for, and we've got nuclear weapons out my window, of which we overwhelmingly rejected. So off the top of my head, there is three. Now we start getting down to some more prosaic things, benefits cuts, universal credit cut, fuel duty. There are 101 things which in fragile rural communities are incredibly important, because we don't have the support mechanism that big cities have or large towns have. And so there's an even greater need to identify and prop up and support people who need it in these fragile rural communities. And that social safety net, from day one, we've always said that our office would be part of that social safety net. We would be a signposting service to and a recipient from others. And what we are seeing is the gaps in that net are being deliberately made wider, and that more and more people are falling through, and there are more and more people that we are unable to help because of the legislation changes from this government. And it is heartbreaking.
Well, Carol, the same question to you, but maybe you could add on what's been the impact for on the opportunities for young people?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably first and foremost, it's their ability to be mobile. If you look at young people and possibly wanting to travel, as some young people do, that's become more difficult. Many young people, though, I mean, just want to kind of get out, get their job set up. And we've got minimum wage been set by Westminster, a minimum wage that's only a minimum wage if you're over a certain age. So if you're under 25, your minimum wage is less than it is for others. So we've got this minimum wage that they've now given its funny name, the pretendy living wage, as Alison Hewlett, our colleague, would call it. But this national living wage, as they call it, it's not the living wage, it's the national living wage, which is essentially a minimum wage. So this minimum wage impacts their ability to go out and earn a decent living. But I mean, I also want to just kind of mention another couple of things. And some of these are quite niche things, but nevertheless, they are important. We've talked a lot about Brexit. Now, Brexit, the biggest impact on Brexit is our ability to trade goods, services, move people about, move finances about. That's our biggest impact for Brexit. But there are other things as well. And up until the point of Brexit, we were part of Horizon 2020, which is a European collaboration in science and research, which allows young people to be part of the biggest group of scientific research on the planet, essentially. Because of carry on with the Northern Ireland Protocol, they still haven't worked out our membership of the next stage of Horizon, which is Horizon Europe, which means that many research groups, many academics, many sort of young kind of post-doc researchers, early career researchers are not able to participate in these collaborations. And it's becoming more difficult for them. Now, I understand that that's quite niche, but for many young people, that's quite important. But I also want to say something. I mean, Brendan's mentioned a lot of the policies, certainly around benefits, things like universal credit, we have bedroom tax that have been foisted upon us.
The rape clause.
It is important to say that the Scottish Government have done an awful lot of work in mitigating the impact of this. So Westminster takes away, and then Scottish Government uses part of its budget that should be used for other things to mitigate the worst impact of that for people. And we've seen the Scottish Government introduce the Scottish Child Payment of £20 a week for eligible children. So that's children living in poverty, essentially. So it seems as though not only are we getting policies that we didn't vote for, but we're then having to use Scottish government budget to mitigate the impact of these. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Scottish Government should be doing anything but that, and it's good that they've been able to, but they must understand that that's then money that can't be spent on other things. So it's problematic. So I think there are people certainly in parts of England that are feeling the impact of these policies much more acutely because they don't have the buffer of what the Scottish Government's doing. And that doesn't mean it's not tough for people here in Scotland as well. But at least in some areas, the Scottish Government is able to make things slightly easier.
And that's running up to hundreds of millions of pounds. I think something over £700 million in mitigations.
It's a huge amount of the Scottish Government's budget, yeah. And it's important it's spent, but it's huge.
Okay, I want to finish up this episode with a conversation on nuclear weapons. Carol, your constituency in Glasgow Northwest isn't far from Faslane. Of course, Brendan, you can see it out the window pretty much. And that's the UK's nuclear submarine base. How does that being there sit with you? Do you think nuclear weapons are an appropriate use of taxpayers' money in a modern country? Do you think they're morally acceptable? And I think we should also note that I think the cost of renewing Trident is now up to something in the region of £200 billion.
Well, I should say, first of all, Drew, that I was campaigning against nuclear weapons before I was campaigning for Scottish independence. And it was one of the reasons, one of the many reasons, but one of the kind of key reasons that I became interested in Scottish independence, because I saw that as the only vehicle really to get rid of nuclear weapons from the Clyde. Yeah, it's about 30 miles from where I am just now. So if anything did happen, or there were to be an attack, it would be people in Glasgow that would be feeling, well, Brendan wouldn't feel it, he'd be gone instantly. he would
vaporised.
Feel it. But it's interesting. So, I mean, there's been... It's interesting. Now, here's the thing. Ben Wallace has made some comments, I think yesterday or today, that he's started saying things about Scotland's policy, or the SNP policy on NATO and an independent Scotland. And he said, oh, it used to be the case that they weren't for NATO, and we'd need to be careful about this in the future. The SNP's been very clear. We had a very big and highly publicised motion at conference, a number of years back, where our position on NATO was decided and has been clearly stated many, many times. Yeah. So we are committed to being a member state of NATO, but we are not committed to hosting the UK's nuclear deterrent here. We should be campaigning to get rid of these weapons throughout the planet, actually. And I think we can only do that if we take the position of getting rid of them from here. So this would be a piece of work that would be started immediately following an independence vote, or a vote for independence.
And Brendan, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I joined very, very much with Carol, and it's interesting this weekend, and I'm sure you'll join me in and wishing a happy 40th birthday to the Faslane Peace Camp. And,
Happy birthday to the Faslane Peace Camp.
Celebrations and just as some events happening just down the road over the weekend, which I hope to manage to get down to tomorrow. And yeah, it's got bigger and it's got smaller and bigger again as the immediacy of the debate on Trident has ebbed and flowed, but I think we should thank them for being that permanent conscience of the nation. You know, they've been there for 40 years and, you know, well done to them. Because I think they can see it as we've seen in, as well, in full disclosure mode, I think I was also a member of CND before I was a member of the SNP. Although I've been a member of the SNP for 42 years, so show you how long
now everyone can believe how old you are.
Anti-nuclear credentials are, but I've said I've always believed, and I will never waver in my belief that, you know, there's no economic, military, or moral case for having nuclear weapons. For the United Kingdom, it's a political weapon. It always has been a political weapon, and it's there almost as a national virility symbol.
Well, stay with
It's as a seat at the big boys' table at the United Nations.
Absolutely, and it is exactly that, Carol. It's this myth of being a superpower, and it is a complete myth. And without those nuclear weapons, then we wouldn't have that seat at the table. And yes, yet again, this is the United Kingdom in search of a better yesterday. And I think there has to be a better future. There has to be a more strategic future for an independent Scotland. And I will repeat ad nauseum that key to that strategic future defence for independent Scotland is Faslane. And Faslane can and will be whatever a Scottish government deems it to be. And it will be a huge part of our contribution to our NATO allies. Because we, whether we like it or not, we are in a strategic hotspot in the world. That Greenland, Iceland, Scotland gap has to be defended and has to be monitored. It has to be protected. And we have a fantastic facility on our doorstep which gives you open access into the North Atlantic. And so there's nothing incompatible with being anti-nuclear, but still maintaining our membership of NATO. And I share Carol's belief absolutely that we have to start that process of unilaterally disarming as soon as it's practical after independence. As soon as it's safe to do so, we get those weapons out of here and we have a far more positive, outward-looking and collaborative defence for an independent Scotland as part of NATO.
Important to underline, of course, that the majority of NATO member countries don't have nuclear weapons.
Well, there are only three. It's the United States, France and the UK. No one else has them. And, you know, if you think, you know, the United States has got 5,500 warheads and the UK's contribution is somewhere around 220 or something like that. You know, so it gives you the scale of what the UK has. And the idea that that is independent of the United States is utter fanciful nonsense. And to sink, you know, £200 billion into renewing it, you know, when at the same time as you're cutting army numbers and you're cutting conventional defence forces, it just lays bare this whole political weapon argument, because that's what they are.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to add. I mean, we've seen with the war in Ukraine how important it is to have a conventional capability, and you know, what we should be concentrating on is our sea defence. And, you know, only now are we starting to see some frigates been built after years of not having anything. So everything essentially was going into the one basket. You know, all the eggs were in one basket. If Putin decided to invade here, we could either wave a pitchfork at him or we could nuke him, because everything else has been cut right down to the bone. And it's I mean, that's really, it's not the way modern defence should be. We need to be spending much more money. And I would hope in an independent Scotland, we look at these areas. We look at things like cybersecurity. We look at space, because space is where the next kind of important area, as well as the current important area, if you consider that much of our economic trade and lots of our communications are all controlled from space. That's where we should be putting money towards, not into an outdated, big white elephant that's not going to do what it's supposed to do. And I can also say a wee word of thanks to the peace campaigners. And Brendan and Drew will know, maybe not all of the listeners will know that my husband served on the Trident submarines, and he always, as he passed the peace camp, always gave them a wee toot toot and a wave. And one time he was asked at the gate of Faslane why he was doing that, and he said, "We serve here so that their democratic right to protest is preserved there. And don't ever forget it, regardless of where you are on the nuclear question. That is really important, that if we're in the armed forces to defend democracy, then part of the democracy is their right to campaign against us." So I think that's important as well. What
a fantastic anecdote that is to bring up for us. We're kind of running out of time here just now, so I want to ask you another question. It's one we ask all of our guests on Scotland's Choice. You've already talked about, immigration and the fact that if we had powers over that, we'd probably be making very different choices. But if you could take another policy, one other policy that you could change from an existing one that we can't currently due to being tethered to Westminster, what would that policy be, Brendan?
I think you're right to identify immigration. I think that's number one. Off the top of my head, I think that one of the worst things that this government has done at Westminster is cut overseas aid. They cut £4 or £5 billion of aid in the middle of a global pandemic was bordering on wicked, and it was done in the absolute certain knowledge of the consequences. And in my role as international human rights spokesperson, I'm now again doing quite a bit of travelling, and I go to these places, and the impact of the cuts are there for all to see. They're undeniable. So one thing I would ensure that the Scottish Government spent as much as it possibly could, and certainly met its minimum international obligation to overseas development.
And Carol?
It's difficult to, I've started scribbling things down, Drew. It's difficult to...
Only asking for one.
I know, but the thing is, what Brendan says about international aid, I mean, there are impacts as well that we feel here as a result of not investing internationally. When we look at people coming here and we talk about, migration to the UK from parts of Africa, part of the reason for that is that countries are not investing, and there's not kind of businesses being developed there in developing world. So these are things that investment in international aid actually does help, and it helps to keep people and giving people the ability to remain where they're born. So I mean, there are reasons why even the Tories might consider looking at the benefits for investing globally. But I think one of the things that I have
hold my breath on that, but yeah.
No. I think one of the difficulties I have is with tax legislation. And you've asked for one thing, and that is, I believe the UK has the most complex tax laws in the world, but that allows businesses to offshore their wealth so that they're not paying tax. It allows Russian oligarchs to launder money within the City of London and within various Scottish limited companies, as they're called. There are all sorts of loopholes and poisonous little warts within UK tax law. Mm-hmm. So I think it would be great if we could rip that up and start again, where we actually have a tax law that works for those that live here in the UK, but better still, maybe with an independent Scotland, we can start again and we can write proper tax laws that are a benefit to all of us.
Carol Monaghan.
Sorry, Drew, can I just
Sure.
jump very, very quickly? Carol was saying about investing in the developing world. Of course, climate change is a huge driver of migration. There is a belt around the equator in which people can no longer live. Desertification, I like to call it, is moving south and it's moving north, and it's dragging people with it. At a time when the United Kingdom are cutting aid and sending people back to Central Africa. It just shows a lack of incredible short-term thinking and a lack of being able to think outside of silos. And that's a hallmark of the UK.
But we could actually use those people here in Scotland as well if a chance. But anyway.
Okay, Brendan O'Hara, Carol Monaghan, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Scotland's Choice.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks, Drew.